We have to keep in mind that Pastor Stephen, he did come at Holy Orthodoxy and he called it a scheme of Satan. He said that our worship is false. And what does Paul say about arguments that are levied against, the things of God? We cast them down, we destroy them, is what the term is. This is Holy Orthodoxy. It's the faith of the apostles handed down. I mean, this is something we need to take seriously, especially when their arguments fall apart with the slightest bit of scrutiny.
Welcome back to Barrel Age Faith. Today I have a special guest, Alex Soren. You've probably seen him online. Alex, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Cassian. It's my pleasure.
I've really enjoyed your videos, and I know that many of my friends have been sharing your videos because of they're like succinct, they're just like positive and upbeat. And there's a lot of interviews and videos out there that are like 2 or 3 hours long, but you say it in like 30 minutes or 20 minutes. It's very succinct, and I really enjoy it. So appreciate your work that you're doing at your
Thank you
channel.
very
What's the
much.
name of your channel, by the way, so people can subscribe right now?
So it's just Alex Soren. So Alex, my first name, Alex space Sorin.
And we're not going to be diving into like your life story today. We'll save that for another time. But I do kind of want to like touch on like, okay, Alex, who are you? What's your story of becoming an Orthodox Christian? And then what maybe has been the inspiration to kind of jump in and make videos that have been so helpful for people?
So I guess my whole shtick is like, my name is Alex. I'm a lawyer and an Orthodox Christian. I like to talk about Orthodox theology and apologetics, right? But I was not raised that way. I was raised in a Romanian Pentecostal household, which is somewhat unique. It has a lot of parallels, of course, with American Pentecostalism, but I don't think Romanian Pentecostals are really aware of how many holdovers they do have from Orthodoxy, because it is an Orthodox country, and it's been Orthodox for centuries. You could say since Saint Andrew brought the gospel over there. Um, but yeah, so we have Orthodox Christianity for like many centuries, perhaps at least over 1,000 years. Uh, and then you have about 100 years ago, American Pentecostalism through uh, Amy Semple McPherson. Usually there was a little bit of influence there, but she was the main push that brought Pentecostalism to Romania. So my grandparents were Orthodox, but that generation, especially around the communist era, they lost trust really in any like organized structural religion. So, this Pentecostalism, it's even more decentralized than Orthodoxy, because that's a decentralized religion, but you do have a structure within, each autocephalous church. So my grandparents converted to Pentecostalism, and my parents were raised in it, and that's the tradition that I was raised in as well. So I think many Pentecostals, we would have the same struggles when it comes to theology, having any definitive answers to theological questions. And basically, I went on a search for, what was the true Christianity. What ended up happening was maybe 2 or 3, 4 years ago, a bunch of people in my circle went more into the hyper charismatic movement, like the NAR and things like that. Uh, so I basically just applied my legal skills as a litigator to look at Christianity, to look at the history and say, look, what are the facts? Like, what happened? Who is involved? Who are the actors here? What are the things everybody agrees on that are not in dispute? And I think once you go down that trail, it will inevitably lead you to Orthodox Christianity. And the last 2 years have basically been me reading every single book that I can find and treating it like a legal case, basically becoming an expert in this very one narrow issue, and finding out what the truth is.
Wow, what a journey. Yeah, I mean, on a lot of your videos, it says like like a lawyer is like unpacking these things, and so it's fun to hear your background as looking at these things as a lawyer and making. There's been all those popular books like Case for Christ by like Lee Strobel or Trent Horn wrote a book I think called The Case for Catholicism. He has a little bit of I think like a law background, and your study as a lawyer kind of like led you to orthodoxy.
Yeah, no doubt.
Yeah,
It
that's pretty
definitely
cool.
played a big role. Yeah. I think that paradigm, especially of just, what are the things everybody agrees on, right? I think once you break it down to that, it becomes like very clear.
Yeah. Like when you look at history, there is a conciliar like orthodox position against heresies. I mean, it's very obvious. And so of course some of the fathers may have like little diverse theological opinions about this speculative matter or whatever, but generally there is this massive consensus about this is orthodoxy, this is heresy. And when you follow that stream throughout history, yeah, it's like the Orthodox Church.
Yeah, and this is not something that's in dispute either, right? It's famously with the Catholic documents that you have coming out, the Roman Catholic, I should say, like the Chieti document, and like, sure, this is not a magisterial document, but this is their own commission, right? Their own commission goes on a fact-finding mission, and what conclusion do they come to? The Orthodox conclusion.
Mm. Yeah, I spent quite a bit of time as of course I grew up evangelical, then became Catholic for a good solid 13, 14 years. And then it was really kind of like living in that ecumenical, I call it this ecumenical movement, not like other world religions, though they do that too. I was kind of very much into like the Orthodox Catholic thing. And you do kind of go back time and time again and be like, wow, like, Catholicism is making a lot of concession points to the Orthodox perspective on a number of different doctrines and issues.
It's to the point where these things are not a matter of opinion anymore, right? Like, it's not like, oh, it could go one way or it could go another. It's like, these are the undisputed facts.
Yeah, to the point where a lot of Catholic apologists are sort of even kind of shifting their argumentation really,
Mhm.
to a much more sort of like reserved perspective. But we could talk more about that on your when we talk about your journey. How seriously did you consider the Roman Catholic option or the Anglican option, which many people kind of are surveying these different possibilities in connection to the ancient church. So, what have been so far, like what have been some of your favorite videos that you've made so far? I mean, I've enjoyed them all. Has there been like one or a couple in particular that you've enjoyed researching more than some of the others?
I think the my most recent one on sacred objects, I think it's particularly satisfying because when you bring that to Protestants, and I don't think that's a defeater for every single ancient, form of Christianity. Put the air quotes in there. But you see throughout the Old Testament, there's sacred objects, there's icons in Solomon's temple. You have Aaron's staff is kept in the Holy of Holies. The consecrated objects that the Babylonians steal from the temple, that Belshazzar drinks from in Daniel chapter 5. His big sin there was desecrating sacred objects that were consecrated for use in the liturgy in the temple. And when you look at Protestantism, you don't see any sacred objects, not even one. And I had one commenter, mention like, well, the Bible is our sacred object, right? Well, why? Why is it your sacred? Is it perhaps because it's more than the summation of its parts, right? It's not just paper and binding and glue and ink. It is a sacred object, but they have a double standard there, right? Where they'll say some things are sacred objects and other things are not.
Yeah, yeah, I thought a lot about this kind of growing up because I lived in sort of a flattened, I called it a flattened Christian universe, right? Like believe in Christ, like share people with him, but it's flattened. Like there's no hierarchy, there's no symbolism, there's no sacraments. But we did have this tradition growing up that you don't place other books on top of the Bible. The Bible must always be either kept separate from the other books or it's on top of the other books to show symbolically like this is the most important. Look, we also did that with, you go into a cemetery and my parents would say, don't walk on these parts of the ground because it's kind of like sacred ground. Like
Right.
instead of walking over their body, kind of like walk around, don't treat it as just kind of normal dirt. And as it,
Right.
I didn't understand that fully as a kid. And I still kind of wrestled with that even as like a teenager into adulthood. Like, what does this mean as a evangelical Christian that there's a hierarchy of dirt or like
Right.
burial place, right? Like books and then when I was in college, I destroyed a Lutheran altar, but felt bad about it.
Wow.
It was a massive altar, yeah. Story for another day, but in short, I was like this evangelical church plant coming into a Lutheran church that was dying, and I always joke that the altar looks like the stone table that Aslan was slain upon, and it's massive. And apparently it was poured when the foundation was poured.
Oh,
So
wow.
the altar was part of the foundation. We wanted to get rid of it to put a drum set there. So once the church finally died out and moved out the Lutheran church, we could just finally take the grounds, and so we removed all the sacramental objects, if you will.
Right.
and put a drum set, and I was part of the team of, like, jackhammering the altar, removing the rubble, and it was a very I was in a very sort of torn place.
I was gonna say, how did that make you feel?
I
Like,
mean,
is this
I
a sacred object? Is it?
well,
Like
yeah, I was in this place of an intersection where, in my studies, my understanding of theology and liturgy was going up and up and up and up, but I was part of this church plant that was destroying a Lutheran church to make it, like, hip, and they had, like, 20 people and we had 300 people, so it felt very like, "We're the new thing, we're coming in." So it was deeply, yeah, it was a conflicting moment within me, and then I got, ironically, the pastor assigned me to lead communion once a month. Uh, and so then I had to think about it way more about what
right,
is communion? Like, what does this mean? And my view was that by that point, it was already beyond symbolism, like, or
right.
beyond just mere matter or mere memorialism, but was actually something was going on. And so we kind of created a small liturgy, and then created we got rid of we weren't doing the crackers and the little cups that I did as a Baptist, but rather intinction and dipping it in a cup and sharing from the
Right.
same. So, anyways, that was my process, but it was like, okay, there's something more going on here.
Yeah, and if I could mention one more video, there's the video that Ortho Bros love the Bible,
Yeah,
and I
what
guess
a funny title. Yeah.
maybe it's, like, the lawyer side of me, but, like, I find a distinct pleasure in, like, taking arguments that, Protestants or Catholics or that the other side would go for and trying to turn them into our favor, which because orthodoxy is true, all of the arguments are in our favor, we just have to find the path there. But, especially, like you mentioned communion, like, Paul says that, communion is koinonia with the body of Christ. It's koinonia with the blood of Christ, right? That's a very intimate kind of fellowship. He talks about the altar of Christ in Hebrews 13. He talks about you cannot eat from the table of Christ and the table of demons, right? And every time I bring this up to, uh, evangelical, neo-Protestant, who they have like that memorialist view, right? Say, oh well, that's a metaphorical table. It's not a real table. This is a metaphorical altar. Well, it's like, how much is metaphorical? Who decides what's metaphorical? Is it just however you feel that day, right? So I
Mhm,
think
yeah.
because our foundation is in the apostolic deposit, we should be the ones most eager to go to the Bible, and uh, the essence energies distinction being laid out in Paul's epistles right there, that was something that blew my mind as a Protestant, because
Yeah.
I think as I described, in that video as well, it was like, dude, why are these Orthodox people talking about energies? Like, is this some like Hindu, Far Eastern kind of thing? Like, what energies? What are they talking about? And come to find out, it's in the Bible. It's just hidden with behind the English words, but it's there. It's in the Bible.
Oh, yeah. I mean, when you read St. Paul and you really, like, see the translations from the Greek, and they're not just translating it into workmanship, and you translating it into, like, energy. It's right there in Philippians, it's right there in Colossians, it's all over the place. When I started reading Dr. Michael Gorman, he talks about theosis
Right.
being the heart of Romans and being the
Right.
heart of Paul's theology. It's like, wow.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
Protestant scholarship's even beginning to recognize these things more and more.
Yeah, and, I think there was one Protestant scholar in particular that helped me slot everything as into its proper place. Dr. Michael Heiser, the late Dr. Heiser and the Divine Council theology. When I was investigating these things, I read The Unseen Realm and I ate that book up. I had
Mhm.
notes everywhere, sticky notes, uh, notes, underlining, circling, whatever. And the book I read immediately after Unseen Realm was Stephen DeYoung's Religion of the Apostles, and
Mhm.
he has an entire section on the Divine Council in there. And I'm over here thinking like, wow, Divine Council theology is like cutting edge evangelical scholarship. You go to Orthodoxy, it's not cutting edge. That's just what they've believed for 2,000 years. It's not cutting edge theology. It's just theology.
Right, and it's like, if you just asked your typical Orthodox person, like, "Hey, what do you think about the divine council?" They may have no idea what the response is because it's experienced liturgically.
Right.
You're going up the mountain, and within the
Yes.
divine liturgy, the council is being gathered. You see this even in the book of Hebrews, where you're approaching Mount Zion,
Hmm.
and the whole host of heaven is present. And this is
Right.
not just some future event at Christ's return, like, this is happening in worship.
It's
now.
not just a metaphor.
Yeah,
It's real.
it is, and it makes a lot of sense for the patron saints of cities,
Mhm.
patrons, angels, what you see in the book of Daniel with angels fighting each other in the cosmic realm. Like, Daniel, I couldn't
Yeah.
get to you because I was battling out this other guy who's like, in charge of Persia.
I would have been here sooner, but I
Yeah,
got caught up, you know?
yeah, it's wild
So,
stuff. Mhm.
Archangel Michael came to help me, and I was able to come visit you, but, who knows what would have happened.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So it is interesting to kind of like be aware of modern historical scholarship, particularly in the evangelical world where they tend to be, they're not saying like wild things about Christology. And then you take that work, that scholarship, and then you see the intersections with the ancient church. And for me, Heiser was not even on the scene when I was doing this yet. Or I mean, I wasn't aware of
Right.
Heiser. He hadn't had his popular moment yet. But for me, I did that a lot with like Dr. N.T. Wright back in like 2008
Yeah,
or
actually,
9.
well, now that I think
Yeah.
about it, he kinda had a similar cultural role to that Michael Heiser did.
Exactly. They're
A
playing
new
the exact
perspective
same
on
role.
Paul, yeah,
Mhm. It's like the academic scholar meets the pop theologian or the pop,
yeah,
cultural pastor. Those hybrid roles, they're important. I think they actually are important for not keeping academia in these ivory towers,
mhm,
but actually helping people study our faith at a much deeper level. That's why I appreciate like someone like Father Stephen DeYoung who's doing that at a very
absolutely.
cool, so many people when they mention their stories into orthodoxy right now, I talk to people every Sunday at coffee hour, and it's like the Lord of Spirits pops up way more than I mean, I knew people were impacted by Lord of Spirits, but I didn't realize how much. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, so it's pretty cool. All right, so today we're gonna be talking about altars, relics, icons. I really enjoyed your last video talking about relics, and then we're gonna be responding to Pastor Stephen. So I did a video like a week or two ago responding to a Baptist pastor talking about the lie of orthodoxy.
That seems to
And
be a running theme with them, this all the smack talk is up front, and then when it comes time to deliver the argument, there's just not much there.
yeah, everybody's begging for Gavin Ortland to get back on. Uh but it's true. And so he came out with a part 3. So we're gonna kind of discuss like some of his thoughts on icons and kind of go through that. But I kind of want to talk about before we got into that icon video, I did want to talk about relics because I enjoyed you talking about relics before icons. That's actually one of my favorite sort of logical connections.
Mhm.
What did you find in studying uh, relics in relation to like the communion of saints?
Well, you see relics, like, very early on. Like, the first one that I mention is Joseph's bones, right? That's at the end of Genesis, and I don't think it's just a coincidence that Genesis begins with, like, an immortal man, with God in paradise, and it ends with, one of the Old Testament saints dead in a coffin. Like, it goes out of its way to in the text to say that he's buried in a coffin, and, when I saw that, I immediately thought, like, clearly this was a special object for the Israelites at that point because it had been, according to Stephen in Acts chapter 7, 400 years of slavery. They didn't forget about that guy. They remembered that they had a promise with Joseph to bring his bones into the promised land when they leave Egypt. And when you look into the Jewish Midrash, which I thought this was like really blew my mind, which is generally considered to be like a second temple consensus. It's like slightly post second temple Judaism. But you could probably see a bunch of people during that period holding this belief that during the procession in the 40 years in the desert that the Israelites maintained, they had, the Levites carrying the Ark of the Covenant. And according to the Midrash, Joseph's bones, his relics, were right next to the Ark of the Covenant in that procession through the desert. So this was a relic that was held in high regard in the first book of the Bible, in Genesis. And you see it all throughout the Bible, Aaron's staff, there's Elijah's mantle. These are all physical objects that God is working through to effectuate miracles or, objects that are just held in very high regard because they're in such close, uh, what's the term? Close
Proximity.
proximity. Yeah, close proximity
Yeah.
to God's people.
Yeah, they're like close proximity to God's people and his presence, particularly if they're kept by the Ark of the Covenant, which would be like his holy presence among them. We don't have any like any specific records in scripture of someone like touching the box of Saint Joseph's relics and becoming healed. But I
Right.
wouldn't be surprised if maybe there it had actually it happened, and maybe um maybe the story where we actually do hear about it in scripture, right? Of the man who is killed and he falls in the bones of Elisha and he is resurrected. I mean, that could even point back to like a tradition that this sometimes happens. We don't know that. I'm just kind of throwing that out there, but it's not inconceivable that what we see in church history wasn't always a part of God's people always.
Right, and one thing that always caught my attention, even as an evangelical, when I was reading the Old Testament, I was like, "Why are they so, like, precise about locations, about where Sarah is buried?" It says, like, she's in this cave across from this field over there in this city, and then you read in the New Testament that, the Jews had already begun decorating the graves of, the patriarchs and their wives, these Old Testament figures. Well, it's because they did go on pilgrimages to go see those sites. Like, why else? What other logical explanation is there to have such precise locations of where these people were buried, where their relics are? Really the only reason to spend, and if you think about it, putting pen to paper back then was much different than putting pen to paper today, right? Like I think it was Father Stephen DeYoung where I heard him say something like Paul's letter to the Galatians would have cost something like 5,000 US dollars in today's money, right? So like a very good monthly salary, right? Months worth of income, like a high end. um so to spend space and ink and time to really specify where these bones and relics are, I think that is very telling to the culture.
Yeah, no doubt. I had a similar experience to you where I'm like, in studying the Old Testament, why are they being so specific about where all these things are? It was a similar experience to when I was reading Lord of the Rings. I'm like, why is Tolkien being so specific about where these mountains are and all these details? But then, if you make a movie out of it, it's pretty helpful. Or if you go on a pilgrimage to a certain location, pretty helpful. And I think it's funny as an American, like we're totally comfortable with that if it's like Gettysburg, um, or like some battle that we're like, yeah, I want to know where it is and where it happened. When it comes to nationalism, we're all cool about it. When it comes to the church, we're like, well, everybody worships. You can worship God anywhere, so it doesn't matter where you go. But if there's a hierarchy and not just everything being flat,
I think you're definitely onto something there with like the civic duty aspect, right? Because you see in Saint Methodius and Saint Athanasius and Saint Basil, the image of the king or the emperor, right? And they compare venerating, images similar to, you pay honor to the image of the emperor, you're paying honor to the emperor himself. Or in the case of Saint Methodius, he does the inverse of that principle, right? Where he says, if you dishonor the image of the emperor, it's like dishonoring the emperor himself. And there's always this connection to civic duty. And I think like, is there a parallel in our modern day to this? Like the kids in school, they pledge allegiance to what? A flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag. Like, do you pledge allegiance to a piece of fabric? No, to the republic for which it stands. Right. So the flag is an icon of the republic. You're not pledging allegiance to a piece of fabric. It goes through the icon to the thing it represents, which is something that everybody I think internally recognizes. But I think as we'll see with I think it's Pastor Stephen today that it's very counterintuitive the approach that he takes. It almost it's contrary to any like natural inclination of logic or wisdom.
right? Yeah, when you put Christ against the sacraments, or Christ against the church, or Christ against His own people, the whole scriptures like just completely fall apart. Like
Right.
we want to keep things in right order, but it doesn't mean that there can't be a hierarchy of thinking, or that Christ couldn't have instituted it that way. When it comes to relics, one of my favorite homilies that people really should listen to is Saint John Chrysostom's homily about Saint Ignatius of Antioch. I mean, this homily is awesome because it's pretty long. I normally share like little excerpts from it, but Saint John Chrysostom is initially in Antioch before he gets transferred to Constantinople. So Antioch's like his hometown. So St. Ignatius is his guy. I mean, that's
Right.
one of the first martyrs of the church who knows the apostles, one of the first church fathers. Everybody's who's ventured into the ancient church knows St. Ignatius of Antioch, but St. John Chrysostom talks about miracles happening when he was processed back from Rome back to his home, back to Antioch. and people
Right.
being, receiving healing, that there's actually grace happening, not even when they just touch his bones, but even the wood. Yeah. So I feel like that's an important. He was making a big argument about matter itself, not just the relics, but also the shrine and the wood and the whole place can be filled with the Holy Spirit. It's kind of a cool.
Yeah. Here's another from St. John Chrysostom, the eulogy of St. Meletius. I think that's something I mentioned in that video as well, where he goes out of his way to say, people loved St. Meletius so much. They named their kids after him. They named their kids Meletius. They put images of they not only honored his name, they honored his image by putting his image on the walls in their rooms, on their signet rings, on their cups. And he closes that eulogy by saying, remember to invoke St. Meletius in your prayers. And in my mind, it just is contrary to any intuitive reading of that at all to say, okay, his images are on the walls, his images are on the signet rings, his images are on the cups, his images are in our mind, his name is on our children. But when we invoke him, we're not going to look at any images.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And then another excerpt from the Fathers that is similar to the one you mentioned about St. John Chrysostom and St. Ignatius of Antioch is at the end of St. Augustine's City of God. I think it's like part 2, chapter 22 or something. He has pages and pages of instances of miracles happening through relics of the saints. And in particular, he mentions, Saint Stephen, the first martyr, that there were young people suffering from seizures that when they went to pray at the shrine of that contained the relics of Saint Stephen, and they're instantaneously healed. And all the people noticed that. He talks about doing the liturgy at these shrines of relics. And when I read that, I was just thinking, Calvinists and evangelicals think that Augustine is their guy.
Right.
This is
Right.
their
Yeah.
guy.
Yeah. Yeah, I did a video a few, maybe 2 years back where I was kind of comparing the quotes of like St. John Chrysostom and St. Augustine to like John Calvin when he's talking about relics. And they just I mean, at the same time I was like, I mean, John Calvin was very upset about corruption in the church and people like taking a dog bone and saying, "Hey, this is a relic of Mary Magdalene." Okay, we can all get upset with
Right.
that if somebody's a criminal. Um, but to throw out the whole idea of treasuring the relics of the saints, venerating and asking for the intercessions of the saints. The whole thing. I think it just goes way too far in comparison to just trying to shut down abuses, right?
Yeah, I've appreciated your work on that. I know you've mentioned the archaeology of like the inscriptions in the catacombs invoking Saint Peter and Paul for the dead and prayer for the dead. Which you don't see only in Baruch and in Maccabees. You see it in the very early church as well.
I've picked that up from all sorts of different people, but yeah, digging in the catacombs will just show you a lot. And when people say something that's not quite right, or it seems to be kind of a false they have a kind of a false confidence. Like a lot of people will say, "Oh, asking for the Holy Theotokos, the Blessed Virgin Mary, like asking for her intercession didn't happen until at least the 4th century." And I'm just like, that seems really improbable to me. Like even if that's like the first place you can like explicitly find it, because I'm like a century before that, you find in the catacombs, 250 AD, inscriptions of asking for the intercessions of St. Peter and Paul. It's to me,
Right.
it feels very far fetched to say they weren't also asking for the intercessions of the Holy Theotokos, which we find, ample evidence that she was highly venerated back then.
Very early
Yeah.
on.
So you just got to put
Yeah.
those two things together. It's like it seems highly improbable that they weren't asking for her intercessions, but that's kind of the thing that we're dealing with. They'll isolate so much of the information, like silo it off, and not
Hmm.
see the uh, integrated whole. By the way, uh, this book, if you haven't gotten it yet, this book is very helpful. Michael Garton's book, Early Icons. Yep, volume one. There we go. Yeah, that's right. So Michael, actually, I'm going to be interviewing Michael here in just a couple days. And,
Oh wow.
yeah, he's coming back on this show. He's been on my show a couple times, and so we're gonna be diving in deep into the worship of the church and all these fun concepts. But I like how you connected relics with icons with asking for the saints to pray for us, the communion of saints, intercession of saints. I kind of view it almost kind of like as a matrix, like a
Mhm.
whole interconnectedness of all of these things, where if you take away one, you can't actually fully understand the others. Is that was that helpful for you in seeing how these doctrines sort of like integrate together?
Absolutely, and I think that was one of my drawbacks from like, my hesitation from joining Orthodoxy at first was, like, you kind of piecemeal take in a fact here, a fact there, and, really, I gotta give credit to the OG Ortho bro, Jay Dyer, right? His conversation with Redeemed Zoomer there really put things into perspective for me where it's like, you have to see things as theological systems, like, your worldview has to stand in and of itself independently, right? There are some things that you cannot take piecemeal, and everything works together, right? So it was like once I got a few linchpins into place, like the divine council theology really helped me with intercession of the saints. Learning more about the arguments of Trinitarian theology, right? Like famously, the principle that the honor you give to the image passes to the thing depicted, right? That did not appear for the very first time in the Seventh Ecumenical Council. That's the argument that Saint Basil makes and Saint Athanasius make. It's the same argument that they use to defend against the accusation that, well, the Son is God, the Father is God, you worship two gods. Well, they said if the Son is the image of the Father, the veneration you give to the Son passes through to one God the Father, creator of all things visible and invisible, as we see in the creed, right? And when you have the image of the emperor and the emperor, that's not two emperors. It's the veneration you give to the image of the emperor passes through to the emperor himself. So it becomes to you get to a point where, like, really, when you have at least a deeper than surface level understanding of the Trinity, and you understand the arguments that each party was making, going back and forth, that it's all very consistent, right? So you cannot have the Trinity without having the doctrine at the Seventh Ecumenical Council. Is if you reject that iconic principle, well, then what do you do about this problem here? If you reject the communion of saints, what do you do with relics over here? It's all connected and it needs to work as a coherent system.
Yes, exactly. And this is why it's important for people to like when they're exploring orthodoxy to not just read about it, but also go, like go to lots of services, visit an Orthodox church. It's important to meet, of course, with the priest, but also just seeing the interconnectedness will happen in the same space of worship. Like when you were giving the example that the tradition that Saint Joseph's bones were kept near the Ark of the Covenant. Well, it's like, well, by the way, the church has been also doing that for 2,000 years, placing relics under the altar or by the altar. What you see in the catacombs
That is a
definitely
huge
becomes
point.
popular in the church. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, and you wonder, where does this tradition come from, right? You have this is something I've kinda gotten into recently, is like the history of Christian altars, right? You see Jerome talking about it, you see Augustine talking about it, how they would go back into the catacombs and they would use, like, the sarcophagi of certain martyrs, the rich ones that could afford a sarcophagi, or they would, like, bring their own table, and over the relics of the martyrs is that they would turn that into their altar for the liturgy. And you wonder today, why does every single Orthodox church have a relic underneath the altar? Well, you have it prefigured in Revelation, right? And I like the Greek term is way cooler than Revelation, right? The apocalypse, John's apocalypse, right? You have the martyrs underneath the altar. You have in the catacombs the martyrs literally underneath the altar. Which church still has that tradition today? One church. I mean,
Right.
the historic church, but one true church, the Orthodox Church. That takes at least, a few options off the table when you're talking about historical continuity.
This is so important because if you're going to take, if you're going into a debate and you're like, well, I'm 50-50, I can actually see both sides. Like I could see this side being true and this side being true. Okay. Well, then what about all the other issues? Who is the more faithful steward in the small thing, like even just the small things.
Mhm.
If you can find that one side has preserved the medium and small things from the ancient church, maybe they actually have credibility in these larger matters.
Maybe they know what they're talking about. Yeah.
Maybe they know what they're talking about because they have a paper trail. I like to use
Right.
the paper trail argument quite a bit. That partly because it worked on me. The
Mhm.
paper trail, it's like if they're faithful in these small matters, then maybe they're also faithful in these other matters, as well. And when you brought up Saint Stephen's shrine, I think Augustine, I think it may have been Michael Garton or Craig Trulia who said that. I think he might even reference there being a scene or an image of Saint Stephen being martyred in that catacomb or in that shrine, which helps you see the interconnectedness. Here is the relics, the body. Here's the altar. Here are people gathering for asking for this intercessions of Saint Stephen, and there is the image of him right there. And so they're all interconnected.
Right. And I feel like a lot of the most vocal opponents of icon veneration will focus on the form over the substance, right? They'll say Nicaea 2 says kissing and bowing. Do we see kissing and bowing? It's like, well, for goodness sake, man. They have an image of Christ like literally top center in the catacombs when the priest offers the Eucharist, or not when he offers it, but during the great entrance, when he goes in front of the congregation and he lifts it up and he looks up. Like, what is he looking at? Like, they're interactive icons. And I can't see like a greater form of reverence than lifting the elements. Who cares about kissing and bowing at that point? Like, that's so much lower than offering the elements, right?
Such an important point, and Michael brings it up quite a bit in his book, where there's multiple forms of honoring and commemorating and venerating the saints through icons. And it's not just like it's unfortunate if you are so restrictive that you take the word veneration into and only kissing, only this or only that, because you can pray through the icon, like you can pray through the image to that saint. And that's actually where I think Michael's book is the most one of the most effective places in his investigations of his arguments is uh, like when you go to these various places, this is not mere decor. This is
Right.
not just didactic for teaching purposes only. The felt board that I grew up with in Sunday school, like just showing you the story. There is something interactive going on here, even with the sacraments or even with the liturgy, which you can only pick up if you're in a liturgical sacramental tradition.
That's right. And whenever you see like a standardized form, right, where you see in more than one setting that Christ is the top center icon, that means there's a reason, there's a function for it. Otherwise, why does everybody have the exact same layout? Right? There has to be a reason. And if this is a place of liturgical worship, I wouldn't you put two and two together and say, "Oh, this is a place of liturgical worship. There's a standardized form for these for the iconography. Maybe it has something to do with what they're doing in the place." Right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah, maybe maybe it does have to do with the actual space itself and how
Right.
the liturgy like how people are worshiping and the orientation. This is why I was really bothered that many Catholic parishes got rid of praying east or ad orientem, which St. Basil says is an apostolic tradition. Like this is something that the apostles gave us. We build churches towards the east, the rising of the sun. We look towards his coming, his parousia. And so there's this real like orientation to worship, and you see that, and that's actually how everything becomes connected. Like the
Right.
whole space of an Orthodox church is even designed ad orientem. You
Right.
can't play around with that in like wild, you know, innovative
Yes.
ways.
Yes. I would like to make one more point on the kissing, though, is that, I mean, if there very well could have been kissing and bowing from the beginning. I believe there was kissing and bowing from the very beginning. And I think one very big evidence of that is the etymology of the Greek term proskuneo itself, right? Proskuneo famously literally means, if you translate the components of the word, it means to kiss towards. It's in the word. There's a connotation within the word already of kissing, right? And whenever you see in the Septuagint version of the Old Testament, the Christian Old Testament, when you see Moses bowing down to Jethro in the book of Exodus, says he bowed and he kissed. When you see David and Jonathan, says David bowed 3 times and he kissed. And in both of those circumstances, the term for bowed is proskuneo. So there is, not in every circumstance, but at least in some instances, where you see proskuneo connected to this idea of reverencing something with a kiss.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. I mean, that to me seems like a plausible case that can be made. I mean, when I was doing my biblical theology course or studies with an evangelical institution, when we studied proskuneo, we were like, man, this is a very robust word for worship that we don't think is reflective of the worship that we have currently in the churches that we were all going to be going out to from from the degree that we were getting. And so I'm really glad that you brought that up because I remember 20 years ago having a moment realizing, oh, this is a very like robust word. Yeah, that's pretty cool. That's pretty cool. All right, so do you have anything you want to say about relics or icons or altars before we jump into engaging, responding to Pastor Stephen?
Well, I mean, there's so much more that there is to say, right? But I would say to check out my video on sacred objects on my YouTube channel. And I do have a follow-up video based on an exchange with, Gavin Ortland and Michael Garden did get involved in that exchange too on X. So look out for that video. That will be coming soon, if not already by the time this one is released.
Yes, definitely check that out for sure. Um, Michael Garten made a very good sort of like argument on X, a thread, if you will, and in Michael Garten's own way. And Gavin made the claim. What was his claim that he was making? It wasn't really even about icons. It was more of just about like if you look at continuity from the early church to the modern times. Well, Catholics, Protestants, and Orthodox have all made massive changes, so none of us should be a leading candidate. I think that was kind of the gist. Is that right?
Yeah, I think this is not only his tactic. I don't want to single out one person, but I think overall for apologists in that Protestant realm, they do have to muddy the waters because otherwise it becomes very clear. So there's this tactic of, the early church was not Protestant, right? And they make this concession. And then they follow up and they say something along the lines of, nor did the early church look Catholic, nor did it look Orthodox. The early church looked like the early church. And that was the essence of his initial response. And I think of his initial tweet. And my response, which I think it was the most liked one, thanks to you guys, followers, subscribers, was saying, nice try. Because when you just, and his tweet, the essence of it was look at it. He used the word look specifically. It didn't look this way. But if you look at the configuration of icons in the catacombs and the configuration in any like modern normal Orthodox parish today, it's nearly identical. Nearly identical. So there is one church that looks like the early church. The Orthodox church looks like the early church. So in my mind, it seemed very obvious to be like, okay, nice try. I see you're muddying the waters, right? And then Michael Garden had that very exhaustive, like very good thread, in my opinion, where he pointed out like there are many inherently venerable images, right? And if you're familiar with like the liturgy, as we are, if you're even vaguely familiar with the rites of baptism and the way the priests go about doing these things, it's very obvious these are images that are meant to be interacted with liturgically, right? Which is it kissing? Is it bowing? Who cares at that point? It's in your worship. It's involved in your worship, right? And that's the claim we're making that they were used for worshipful liturgical purposes. Uh, and the approach that, Gavin and other apologists like this have to make is just a general skepticism. And as we know from, every single Jay Dyer debate with an atheist, that's an untenable position. You need to argue from something affirmative. You can't only argue from skepticism. It will fail. What if you applied that same standard to the canon of scripture? How does that work? You apply one standard to Orthodox images, but you see centuries before the canon of scripture. I would say until the 1800s, you don't see the modern Protestant canon of scripture, because even the classical Protestants kept the deuterocanonical books, in an appendix of sorts.
Right.
It was the publishers in the 18 and 1900s that removed it completely to save costs. And that's where you get the modern Protestant Bible from. That puts them in a very, very tenuous position.
Yeah, where people aren't even knowing the sacred stories that are there, like Tobit. It's just like or the Book of Wisdom. And I because I was in a biblical studies degree work, I think I was very much in tune with what you just said. Or like, I'm wanting to respond to people that are being hypercritical to the integrity of these stories in Scripture. And I cannot do that to the fathers. That doesn't mean that I can't, we can talk about them having different understandings of what they were writing, of in comparison to the scriptures, but to be hypercritical to them, like these guys are being with the scriptures, I can't do that. That would make
Right.
me a hypocrite. So there has to be a little bit of a fair standard that's going on there. So I'm glad you brought
Right.
that up. Yeah, that's really good. My background too is I started out as a biology major, so I did theology, and I was also doing like environmental studies and biology. So I think kind of like in ecosystems. And so when we talk about this continuity versus change debate, I like to always bring it back to that ecosystems. If someone says, "You idiot Orthodox, don't you recognize that you've had change in your history?" I'm like, yeah, that's not the claim isn't that we haven't had any change at all. That's you're you're probably misunderstanding what's being
Why
said.
isn't your liturgy in Aramaic?
Right, it's like, I know I see this so much, like, "You're an idiot, don't you realize that there's been change?" That's like,
No, I've
that's
never thought
not
that before.
never
You
thought
got
about
me.
that.
Yeah.
You got me. It's like as if there had been no additions to the liturgy whatsoever or something. So, when you look at an ecosystem, though, what it is, you go into I love going into a very healthy forest. And you see what you see in that forest is an interdependency of different kinds of plant life, different kinds of animals, different kinds of trees, different kinds of bugs in the soil that are helping to both enrich the soil but also create cross fertilization. And so what you see is this sort of tapestry of interdependence. I think we were kind of talking about that a little bit about how relics and altars and icons and prayer of the saints and all these things are interconnected. And so when you start like lopping out very key parts of that ecosystem, you don't just lose what's taken out. You actually lose large sections of what's taken out. So if you take out icon veneration, you're probably going to lose relic veneration and even intercession of the saints. So you see this happening in the Protestant world where maybe there were some concerns initially about abuses, then they move the goalpost and then they lose this large segment that was a part of the original ecosystem.
Yes, and
So yeah.
yeah, I was gonna say the 2 main fathers that, address the issue head on, Saint John of Damascus and Saint Theodore the Studite, they always connect iconography to Christology, and, there will always be some component of, Protestant Christology missing because of the lack of icon veneration of, iconography.
Yes, and I could talk about this in Catholic theology as well, but we won't get into that because that'd be a much longer conversation. But there can be things off, even I think how Catholics will describe the ecosystem. And so it's not that we're not acknowledging that there isn't change, that there isn't like a story that's being told, but the change is within this type of within this type of ecosystem of interconnectedness. And so that's how it works out, at least in my mind. Hopefully, with my rambling, it helps somebody who's
I
watching.
don't think I've heard anybody describe it as beautifully as you just did. That was like, the trees and, the ladybugs and, all the
Yeah,
relationships, and
it's supposed
wow.
to be a book someday. Who knows if it'll be a book? But
Yeah.
I mean, I guess it's sort of like as a kid, I grew up with the movie Free Willy, which is like about
Right.
this whale, right? And it's like he's
Yeah.
totally out of his ecosystem. Like he's still a whale, but he's not functioning in a healthy way whatsoever. And so the whole goal
Mhm.
of the movie is to set him free so he can go back and live within his original ecosystem. And when you get into like a school of these whales, I mean, that you don't really understand what a whale is until you see it alive in its ecosystem.
Right.
Like if it's dead on a lab table, you don't understand it. You might understand its parts, and a lot of like hyper scholasticism in the Middle Ages was trying to understand the parts of theology, and then you get overconfident thinking that you understand it, but it's not living within the patristic ecosystem
Right.
anymore. Once it's just kind of like laying dead on the lab table, and also if you have it trapped like in a zoo cage. So you can take all these types of analogies of like a frog in a frying pan versus a frog in the pond, or the whale in the sea versus at SeaWorld, and you can see how this interconnectedness helps us make sense of not just God's creation, but also theology itself. Uh, Dr. Timothy Patistas, in his book, The Ethics of Beauty, really hits this home. I think he might call it the third way of knowing, where you can't actually fully explain it. Um, it's interconnected. You know it's true. You know if you take this away, it's going to be devastating, but you can't fully explain it. To me, that's Orthodox theology.
That was beautiful. But I think there is definitely something there to where, this argument from aesthetics that it does serve as a sort of, glue to things. You have like this tile and that tile, this tile, but where's the grout? You know, it's this ecosystem as you described it.
Yeah, I mean, this is where I think someone like Jonathan Peugeot is finding his place right now. Like everybody's wanting to talk to Peugeot. I mean, it's
Right.
like iconographer. Like, why do the philosophers of this world want to talk to Jonathan Peugeot? Why do the guys who are creating AI they actually want to talk to Jonathan Peugeot? All these people, whether to like seek wisdom or seek a blessing, uh, those are two different things. One is help me understand why I maybe shouldn't be doing this. The other is I'm gonna go do this. Can you just bless this thing since you're one of the moral philosophy guys of our age, you know? Uh, but I got to spend a little bit of time with him at the Touchstone conference, and he was talking about these things, like camp fireside conversations he's having with people, and it was like fairly mind blowing.
He is such a smart guy, and I think that, like, talking about aesthetics is such an elusive thing, right? Because when we talk about, like, "Oh, the Bible says," like, "Joseph's bones, this and that," that's very concrete, right? But when you talk about beauty, that is something so abstract and elusive, like, it's so hard to pin down, and when you have somebody like you were talking about knowledge through experience, just going into the ocean, observing whales in their own habitat, or, the Orthodox, "Come and see, come and see, come and see in the liturgy." There is something about just like being there, just absorbing this thing to where you will obtain a certain knowledge that you can't get from a book, that you can't get from a lab or a test tube. You have to actually be there. There's some organic connection there it's so elusive, right? It's so abstract. It's so hard to pin down.
It is. It's very difficult to put it into words to people, and that's why you have to
Why
almost live
Jonathan
in
Peugeot
reality.
has so much momentum, I think.
I think you're right. Like it really is. I mean, he's speaking not only to like someone like Dr. Jordan Peterson in psychology, but people who are into philosophy are people who are making policies in the United States. I mean, he's
Right.
talking to everybody, and they
Yeah.
want to talk to him. So it's a pretty cool moment for like the Orthodox worldview to actually be quite helpful in healing the world. Now,
Mhm.
how much fruit will this take place over the next few decades? That's only in God's hands. We don't really
Right.
know. You can only participate in that opportunity that's given to you, and then you see what God does with it. Paul Kingsnorth talk at the Touchstone Conference was kind of a contrast where he he is very hopeful about people becoming aware of the Orthodox Church and what Christ is doing in the Orthodox Church, but there's this incoming like world changing doom of AI, which could bring the apocalypse or something. So it's like
Certainly. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. It was really good that Peugeot his talk was right after Kingsnorth's because I was like that was like that Kingsnorth talk was awesome. It was amazing. But I was kind of feeling like I was feeling a little dark there for a moment. And then Peugeot like just brings me right back up. And
I'm sure it helps that Jonathan Peugeot is also brilliant as a person, right? So
yes.
you put that together with, his background and experience in iconography, beauty, aesthetics, the philosophy of aesthetics, and symbolism, right? The symbolic world. That is just such a awesome counterbalance to like this quantitative algorithm driven AI world where there's something elusive that you can't pin down, that you can't put into an algorithm that people just recognize like in their heart. And then there's on the other end, like binary numbers, algorithms, AI that tries to fake being this elusive thing, but it's not. Everybody can tell it's not.
His key point in his talk, and I don't wanna give the whole thing away, but the key point in his talk was that the machine world is very weak. I think Kingsnorth and Peugeot both said this. We saw this with COVID, with the shutdown. Everything is elaborate and connected, but the moment that you shut this all down, we see, oh, like, the system is just, like, super weak. Like, we can't get our food because they're like stuck on ships because everything's timed down by the minute. Or a clock breaks down, not because the whole thing's broken, but one little tiny part breaks. And so the machine world is very weak. And so the hope that was really given was that, like, in all these mythological stories, is that the dragon, the beast, the machine, whatever it is, eventually self destructs. It like eats, it consumes itself. And AI actually has all those same patterns of actually um, consuming itself. Just was an interesting interesting take. But if you apply what Pajot just said in that talk to what we were just talking about with altars, icons, worship, if you take out, he was saying it in a bad way, the machine falls apart. We were talking about that in theology in more of a healthy ecosystem way. You start, you know, taking things apart. It's like you can't fully understand it.
Right.
So you got to understand both sides of the stories: the story of the beast, the dragon, the machine, and then the story of the garden. Uh, and so when you're getting transported into worship, like if we were to go back and experience true worship with Adam before he sinned, then a lot of things would sort of fall into place about who we're supposed to be as a human. All right, let's talk about Pastor Stephen. I've responded to part one and part two of this video, and this is part three, the lie of Eastern Orthodoxy. Pastor Stephen sort of revealed his cards on why he's doing this three-part series, and it's because he's had people in his own church become Orthodox.
There has been a scheme of Satan that has become more popular in recent years. Friends that I know from seminary, friends that I know from back home, friends that I know from other churches, and yes, even people here who have been led astray not by new lies, but by the same lies that are just now being repackaged in a different way. And it's the lies of Eastern Orthodoxy.